This is Cultural Mixtapes. I'm Tejas Srinivasan. Welcome to the show. I've been reluctant to get into the weeds of politics on this show. We've done a few episodes on specific issues, such as the conversation with Maggie Doherty on abortion, and we've spoken in broad strokes on the political climate of the United States. Indian politics has always been a beast I've been afraid of broaching, both on the show and in my personal conversations. There are countless nuances that are often difficult for listeners outside the country, including myself, to understand. And the debate is so fluid and rampant that it's easy for opinions to be misconstrued and cast aside. A conversation about Indian politics cannot simply be restricted to that. Instead, the far-reaching issues extend into culture, art, and many other aspects of daily life, and require somewhat of a holistic view. In the same way that the writer Gore Vidal believed that his criticism of the United States was sharper when he was observing from abroad, I think the best perspectives of the political scene in India contain simultaneous analysis from the ground and from afar. And there's no better guest to have this conversation with than journalist Samanth Subramanian. His work has appeared in several publications, including The New Yorker, The Guardian, and The New York Times Magazine. He's also global news editor at Quartz. Samanth wrote a piece in October in The New Yorker titled, "When the Hindu Right Came for Bollywood." This study of a cultural conflict in India highlights some of the key agitating issues entrenched in the country's political system today. We use that piece as a starting point and move on to discuss some of the concerning trends emerging from the current regime. Samanth grew up in India and worked there for many years, but is now based in London. This gives his coverage the unique duality that I think enhances his discerning analysis of his home country. But Samanth's beat doesn't just cover politics. A quick look at his output leads to pieces about finance, cricket, travel, so on and so forth. The magazine pieces that he writes are deep dives into intriguing human stories in places we'd not think to look. So our conversation today reflects this, and as we move from India to several other stories, he paints a portrait of a rigorous journalism that is required to tell authentic stories in today's world. A few notes. There are two specific pieces that we mentioned that could benefit from some prefacing. One titled, "How Hindu Supremacists Are Tearing India Apart," which was published in The Guardian, focuses on protests and riots that took place at universities in Delhi. And the second piece, published in New York Times Magazine, titled, "Two Wealthy Sri Lankan Brothers Became Suicide Bombers, But Why?" requires little inferencing, but essentially focuses on Samanth's survey of a community from which two brothers became radicalized terrorists. All the pieces we mentioned in today's conversation, along with his recommendations, are linked in the show notes. Hope you enjoy the show. Samanth Subramanian, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with a piece that you wrote for The New Yorker a few months ago in October of 2022 called "When the Hindu Right Came for Bollywood." In very broad terms, it's essentially about the relationship that the right wing in India is increasingly having with the film industry. And another Substack piece about the article, you describe it as a piece on the Hindu right's gradual, insert noun here, of Bollywood. For listeners who haven't read the piece, would you be able to quickly describe the nature of it and why it's so difficult to pinpoint this exact noun?
Sure. So for anybody who isn't sort of familiar with modern Indian politics, the party that is currently in power at the moment in India, which has been in power for about 9 years now, is called the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's a fairly socially conservative party, but more than anything else, it has a very religiously led view of India in the sense that it believes that India is a country for Hindus above everyone else. And that's quite a sort of sharp break from the previous 70 years of modern Indian history, in which the parties that were in power largely believed India to be a country that is home to anybody of any faith. And so, there are multiple ways in which you can tell this political story, right? I mean, you can actually tell it through a profile of the Prime Minister, who is Narendra Modi. You can tell it through a piece about the party itself. You can talk about the politics at the, in the capital in Delhi. But I think the more interesting and expansive ways to tell some of these stories come from slightly more oblique angles and come from cataloging and kind of studying the effect that this party and its ideology is having on Indian society and culture. And one of the things that is, of course, at least in public perception, central to Indian society and culture is the Hindi film industry in particular. And there's a neat overlap here between the people who tend to watch Hindi films, Hindi being a language spoken predominantly in the north of the country. That also happens to be the heartland, if you will, of the BJP. And so there's a neat overlap between these two audiences. But more than that, there's sort of an interesting exploration, or there was an interesting exploration to be done, I think, about the role of the Hindi film industry in modern Indian history and how that is changing or has been changing over the last 8 or 9 years. And the reason it's difficult to put a noun in that sentence that you quoted, the reason it's difficult to call it the BJP's control of Bollywood or the BJP's infiltration of Bollywood or the BJP's kind of ideological swamping of Bollywood is that none of these things fit exactly. Because the control that the party and the government exert over modern Indian life is exercised in different ways. There are sort of direct ways of exercising it in the sense that you make people afraid of the consequences of doing something that is contra the BJP. There are indirect ways of exercising it, which is when you set up sort of a kind of ideological climate that magnetically pulls towards itself artists or other public personalities who maybe wouldn't have had these kind of ideological leanings earlier or would not have expressed them. There is actually a federal government body in India that sort of exercises censor-like powers over any movie that is released for public screening in India. And so that's another form of direct control. At the same time, Bollywood is such a varied and complicated ecosystem with so many different moving parts that it's virtually impossible for anybody, any party, any government to sit in on every single script run and trial screening and idea generation pitch at the neighborhood bar, and kind of exercise control over all of that directly. So, all these complications make it difficult to say in one word what exactly is going on. So instead, I chose to use 7,000. The New Yorker piece is essentially 7,000 words of trying to explain these various ways in which the ideology of the BJP is affecting the kinds of movies we see and the kinds of movies that are being produced and the kinds of people who are making these movies today.
In your research about this ideological development, as you were in India speaking to people in the industry, working in the industry right now, did you feel that the changes that you were tracking throughout the piece, were they commonly known or prevalent for people on the ground working in the industry or following the industry closely?
Yeah, I mean, it's a weird thing about journalism, right? Is that nothing is ever entirely new to every single person out there. But I mean, I think the nature of journalism is tell the average reader, insofar as such a person exists, tell the average reader what is going on to explain a little bit of the context. But then secondarily, to sort of piece together disparate things that are happening and try to see what kind of narrative they form. And so, if you went to Bombay and if you talk to people in the industry, they will of course say, yes, we know in broad strokes this is happening, and they will perhaps have one or two anecdotes to tell you, and they will have three or four other second-hand or third-hand anecdotes they may have heard from someone else, the details of which are fuzzy and perhaps inaccurate, and so they may be able to tell you the same broad story. But the role of the journalist in this particular case, I think, is to go and kind of verify some of these anecdotes and details, is to put them together, put a chronology over them, overlay a chronology on them, kind of single out maybe commonalities between a lot of these anecdotes. So is there somebody or some group in particular that is affecting some of these decisions that are being made? Are there trends that you can see in terms of the movies that are being produced? And finally, of course, a lot of India and maybe a lot of parts of societies in many other countries of the world seem to treat a lot of things as an open secret. Like this is a very common phrase in India, I feel. It's an open secret that the government does XYZ. It's an open secret that Bollywood is full of people like these.
Uh-huh.
But the thing about the open secret is that nobody actually puts it down in print and nobody actually verifies these stories and makes sure that some of them, ensures that only the right ones go into print and lays them out into something that you can read. For journalists who think that an open secret is a reason not to write about something, I would say quite the contrary. I mean, unless it's been written about extensively, which this wasn't, I think it's something eminently worth capturing.
When you're writing about this open secret and you're talking about how you often got hazy accounts from people that might have been hearsay, um, when you were speaking to these people whose lives had been affected deeply by the issues that we were writing about, maybe not just in this case, but even in broader journalistic context, when sources are airing their grievances at you, essentially, how do you listen to that and then take that to the aggregate story at hand? Or is there a system you have for handling sources when their lives are so deeply intertwined with the issues you're writing about?
There's a couple of levels at this. I mean, one is just sort of how to have these conversations that you're
Mm.
having. And extremely fortunately, this happens to be a skill that any curious person can actually put into practice. I mean, if you're actually genuinely curious about these stories that you're hearing, you will ask the right questions. You will ask exactly the
Uh-huh.
questions that need to be asked. You will kind of, in your own mind, just to make sure that you have clarity about these stories, you will go back over certain details to make sure that you have them accurate in your head and in your
Mm-hmm.
notes. And obviously there's a kind of a degree of empathy that any curious listener must also show while the person is telling their story. And so, but these are, you could call them conversational skills, or
Mm-hmm.
and in which case many people have them, or you could call them interview skills, in which I guess maybe people who are put in this position of interviewing others often, maybe these are the people who have them. But essentially the question is the same. In my sort of experience, I think two or three things are really important. One is to kind of get people to tell actual stories, not just broad, hypothetical, abstract
Mm-hmm.
narratives of what is happening, but like give me an actual example of where something happened. And when they start to tell you what an actual example, you start dissecting the chronology of it, and you start asking really practical questions about very small details. So what happened next, and when did this happen, and who was there at the time, and so on. Almost as if you're a screenwriter trying to populate a scene, and you need
Uh-huh.
to know all the details of what's happening in the scene to be able to populate it. And so once you start asking those questions, the interviewee slows down and
Mm-hmm.
gets more real and tells you these details that you want to hear. And of course, as I mentioned, there is sort of a certain degree of empathy that is called for, because very often these are people's careers at stakes, not
Yeah.
necessarily lives in this case, I think. But certainly, sort of, there's a lot riding on some of these film projects, not just the livelihood of the person making them, but assorted other professionals who work in the cinema industry. So certainly a degree of empathy is called for. At the same time, you can't let empathy overwhelm you, because some of the people you're speaking to are still among the most privileged in India. And so some hard questions have to be asked. So it's a fine balance between one and the other that you have to strike. And then there's sort of a more formal, so that was the first part. And there's a more formal, structured journalistic process that a lot of these interviews are governed by, which is, for example, uh, are interviews on the record or off the record or on
Mm-hmm.
background. At what point do you afford somebody the privilege of going on the off the record or background?
Uh-huh.
What determines that? Do you take a call yourself in any of these situations? Does that change as the story progresses? Can somebody be on the record at the beginning and then asked to go off the record, by the
Yeah.
time you've done like 2 months of research? So there's a lot of that, and would be too sort of, I think, the journalistic nitty gritty of this would bore your readers too much. But that stuff is quite a transparent framework by which all of us operate in journalism, and so that's quite easy.
In this story, and when you're explaining your writing process for this story on your Substack, you write about how it's difficult to often tell stories about Indian politics, and you mentioned that it took you a year to write this New Yorker piece. And you've written quite a few pieces about Indian politics over the years. Where do you think the difficulty lies, specifically in writing about India? You had profile 10 years ago of Kejriwal. You had one in 2020 about protests at university. You had one about the Greenpeace conflict. Where's the difficulty in writing about this country?
There's two different levels of difficulties, and one is the difficulty of writing about this country for a foreign audience,
Mm-hmm.
and the second is the difficulty of writing about the country, full stop. And so let me tackle the first one.
Okay.
The difficulty of writing about this country for an audience overseas comes purely from my own craft driven obsessions as a writer.
Okay.
And when I say that, what I mean is I want every piece that I write, not just about Indian politics or anything,
Mm-hmm.
I want all of them to have interesting sentences in them and interesting
Okay.
phrases. And like I
Mm-hmm.
want the form to vary from piece to piece. And I want to do new things with the craft.
Yeah.
Um, Even if I don't end up doing them, at least I want to feel as if I'm like stretching my limbs in one
Mm-hmm.
way. But the minute you write about an animal as deeply complicated and deeply local as Indian politics, the minute you
Yeah.
start writing about that for a foreign audience, you're essentially swept into this situation where you are providing explanation and context and background all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, almost every single piece about Indian politics that you write for a foreign audience that is any length at all has to go back to 1947
Yeah.
almost to kind of explain what kind of secular spirit the country was born in. As a sort of analogy, if an American listener will sort of try to think about writing a 5,000 word piece about, the 2016 election
Mm-hmm.
and about everything that happened between 2016 and 2020, and if they find themselves having to reach back to 1776 every single time,
Yeah.
you can imagine what a chore that is. The ideas start to become stale and ossified. The language in which you can explain this stuff becomes very formulaic. You have to kind of find different ways of saying the same thing, of explaining a particular political grouping, explaining who this person was in the country's history, and of explaining events between 2014 and now, even, which is 9 years. It's not
Yeah.
very long, but a lot happens, and you have to catch the reader up overseas on all of this stuff
Yeah.
to then be able to reach the present day and say things like, well, so this is what has finally happened. By that time, you've expended, a third of your word quota, you've expended most of your creativity, and it becomes like a chore
Uh-huh.
and a drudge to write that stuff out. Now, it is necessary. I mean, there's no doubt about that, which is why I do keep doing these stories again and again. It is extremely essential to communicate to audiences everywhere um, the kinds of things that are happening in India. But from the craft driven point of view, as I
Mm-hmm.
said, it does sometimes become difficult, and you start to dread the moment at which you will have to find yet another way of describing what the BJP is and what its history is.
Yeah.
So that's, and with an Indian audience, you can take a lot of that for granted, which is what I was going to say.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other part, the second rail of this is just the difficulty of writing about India as a whole and Indian politics in particular. I specifically mean politics here.
Mm-hmm.
And in writing about politics as a reporter in Delhi is not at all like writing about politics as a reporter in Washington, D.C. In Washington, there are, access journalism, as it's called, which is that you cultivate sources and over time they will start to give you information that is new and that you can put into a piece. That is there in every political capital of the world. But in DC, unlike in Delhi, there are also formal processes through which the press can apply for various things. Apply
Yeah.
for an interview, attend a press conference, apply to see documents,
Mm-hmm.
even take appointments with civil servants and bureaucrats. All of that stuff, is procedural to a large extent. And there are actually press conferences in which you can ask questions.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff doesn't happen in India. I mean, the governance itself is so politicized and it's so top down that if you were to sort of want to meet a civil servant these days, it's very difficult to do that, let alone to then cultivate them as a source. There is sort of one, equivalent of FOIA, which is the right to information, which you can use to get public documents to you, but it doesn't always work very well.
Mm-hmm.
They don't always release everything that you want them to release. There is no sort of other separate arm of the government just publishing public domain information, statistics and data and like reports. None of that stuff really exists, and it's difficult to get. And finally, of course, the actual politicians who control this country are very difficult to access and pin down for an interview. I mean, famously, we are now in year 9 of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's prime ministership,
Hmm.
and he has not addressed a single press conference by himself. Um, and he'll coast through to year 10 when he comes up for a re-election next year. And I'm pretty sure he won't address a press conference between now and then. So these are the things that make it really hard to kind of know what is true and what is not, or even to know how decisions get made. I mean, everything has to be inferred from other parts of the ecosystem, where it's a corporate world or maybe the nonprofit world. I mean, you have to kind of read back from things that happen in these other sectors. You have to read back what might have happened within the channels of power.
Uh,
And that's a very unsatisfying way to do journalism.
Adding on to that, does it make your job even harder when your sources and when you're researching in India, when they realize that you're writing for a Western audience? Does that add to your difficulties?
It does and it doesn't. Sometimes it
Okay.
makes things easier. I mean,
Okay.
sometimes, if I was sort of writing for an Indian publication and I wanted to meet, you know, 48 or 50 of Bollywood's top filmmakers and so on, they might not have said yes,
Okay.
but they do say yes if it's a New Yorker, right?
Yeah.
Um, and maybe people say more to Western publications which are published very far away than they might to an Indian reporter. Um, so maybe they open up a little bit more. So it's kind of, there are benefits and drawbacks, I'd say.
From a writing perspective, when you're going about forming your prose and your opinions on these things as you're writing, does being based outside of India change the way you look at it, not just from a research and journalistic perspective, but from forming your stories after doing the work?
Well, I mean, I think one thing does happen, which is that being based out of India, I tend to write about India less.
Okay.
I think if I was living there, and definitely if I was writing for Indian publications, that would be my bread and butter, stock and trade.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not necessarily be stories about politics, but it would definitely be stories about India in some aspect. And I think being based overseas forces you to choose, which is a good thing, I think, especially if you want to write magazine pieces. Because magazine pieces should be, they're long and they should be, because of their length, they should try to operate multiple levels. So it's
Yeah.
not just a story that happened on a day. It has to have like layers and complexities to it that make it more evergreen. So that you can read it 3 years down the line, as you did maybe with the university story in The Guardian,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of find something valuable and interesting and perhaps even persistent in the themes of the piece. So I think because I write for magazines mostly, and because I live outside the country, I really have to pick and choose the kinds of topics I write about when it comes to writing about India, and that can only be a good thing. It means that I kind of get to uh, be extremely judicious about the frames that I give to the more long-lasting ideas that I want to keep exploring. It doesn't exhaust me in a way.
Yeah.
So to do 2 or 3 pieces a year from various angles is quite a good balance.
You mentioned the piece from 3 years ago in The Guardian about the riots at the university in Delhi. In that piece, you write, when a government starts to make the case for some to be considered less Indian than others, subtracting first one identity and then another as if they were Jenga blocks, the structure turns unsteady. As someone who's covered this situation from a variety of angles over the past 3 years, since the obvious COVID challenges aside of the past 3 years, how does that quote sit with you today? Does it feel more urgent, less urgent?
Definitely more, I think. I think there's a kind of long-term insidiousness to some of these plans
Mm-hmm.
that may make it seem between 2020 and now, it may make it seem as if not much has changed. Nobody's been thrown out of the country. When I say nobody, I mean no particular religious group has been thrown out of the country or like stripped
Mm-hmm.
of their citizenship. But the real danger comes from the signals that this government sends out to the to the general population about like what is all right and what isn't, and what is Indian and what isn't. And I think that has been their biggest success.
Mm-hmm.
And they grow more successful at that every year, to the extent that, now, for example, when a research firm sitting in New York publishes a report about a big group of companies in India the owner of which is known to be a close associate of Prime Minister Modi.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some would call him a crony capitalist, but we will sort of refrain from that
Yeah.
label for now. But but when a report like that happens, it is sort of instinctive for a lot of people to think about that report and the people who are writing it as being anti-Indian, even though all that the publishers of the report want to do is make money on the fact that the stock is going to fall as
Mm-hmm.
soon as some of these irregularities in the accounts are exposed. So I think they have made that kind of thinking second nature, and I think that's really the most dangerous thing, because it allows this party to keep coming back to power in the sense that it'll keep preying on those insecurities,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to project itself as the one true staunch champion of India and Indianness. And then secondarily, it also sort of cultivates a persistently divisive mentality, as of always dividing true Indians, whoever they may be, against the world or against other groups. And that process, I think, is still alive and well and is further along the road than ever compared to when I wrote about this in 2020.
This divisiveness that you mentioned, and even in that piece, you were talking about all these labels that have come up and are even more common now: anti-Indian, anti-national, that keep coming up in discourse, in the news, whatnot. Do you have to deal with those sorts of labels and that rhetoric when you're working, and does it have any material effect on the way you do your work?
I mean, all the time. Usually, every time I write a piece about Indian politics, descends at some point into some kind of social media vortex where some of these labels are thrown about. That the writer is anti-Indian, anti-national, lives outside India, and therefore has a vested interest,
Mm-hmm.
has an agenda, has foreign paymasters. Social media vitriol is social media vitriol, and it doesn't really bother me.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, obviously, there are bigger dangers at hand that I do fear. One of them being that I wouldn't be allowed back into India
Mm-hmm.
at some point. And it has happened with a couple of people in the past, one of them being a journalist. That pains me because, of course, I love the country and I love the people living there. And
Mm-hmm.
unlike the ruling party, which is very good at projecting an equivalence, which is that to be against the BJP is to be against India. Uh, I'm very clear about what I'm against. I'm very against the BJP and its ideology, but that is in no way to be equated with being against India as a country and as a
Uh-huh.
society. And so I want to keep going back. I mean, well, one of the reasons I love living in London is I can go back 3 or 4 times a year if I want to, and
Yeah.
that is not something that is easily achievable if I live in the States, for example. And so to be denied that pleasure and that constant reconnection with where I'm from and the people who mean the most to me would be very difficult. But it hasn't happened yet, and I hope it will never happen.
Very staunch way of looking at journalism. Um, we've been talking about India, and it's a very big part of your beat, but it's impossible to put any label on the topics you've covered or any of your pieces under one umbrella. If you look at Muckrack, it yields pieces about Eurovision, sports betting, the Super Bowl, Davos, architecture, and then the odd piece about cricket. Your books have been about fisheries to Sri Lanka, and your latest book on JBS Haldane, The Scientist. What drives you towards a certain topic?
Primarily, the opportunity or the potential I see for the topic to hold interesting human stories or interesting stories about human beings, so stories
Mm-hmm.
about interesting human beings. Um, that's really it. I mean, that's sort of all of journalism, but all of narrative journalism in
Mm-hmm.
particular, which is what I do, is to sort of see a person respond to a situation and see how they evolve as the situation progresses. And everything else can change, in my view. I mean, like if you have the tools and if you have that particular interest, everything else can change. The person can live anywhere in the world and they can
Mm-hmm.
do anything for a living, and the situation that they're being exposed to can be of any kind. But it's almost like a novelist's interest in the human psyche that you bring to this kind of journalism.
Uh-huh.
And of course, it's not immediately always obvious that that is what is motivating you. So for example, I'm trying to think of a piece in which there weren't that many human stories. I wrote a piece about um, hand dryers and paper towels, and like how these two industries are sort of in battle with each other to for the right to dry your hands in public restrooms. And
Okay.
that's kind of it's an interesting sort of,
Yeah.
it's business and technology story, but it doesn't really show human beings, there's no profundity to it in terms of human beings in extraordinary situations. But I still find it interesting because these are still such human endeavors. They're both obviously at a very superficial level, businesses founded by human beings,
Mm-hmm.
but then secondarily also the need to compete and the ways in which you compete with this rival technology for something that is as seemingly banal as a spot in the public restroom, and the kinds of methods you bring to bear on that
Yeah.
and what it says about the people in these industries and what it says about consumers. I mean, all of that stuff is a true gold here. I mean, if that wasn't there, this would really be a very dull piece to write. It would
Yeah.
just be a piece about something that blows hot air and something that is a flat sheet of paper. And that's no fun. So I look primarily for that. And then once I have that, I try to sort of go through as many situations as I can, as many topics. So you mentioned architecture and you mentioned Sri Lanka and all of these different things. But that's sort of the joy of this profession, is that you can immerse yourself for little lengths of time, or sometimes not so little lengths of time, sometimes years at a stretch, in these little worlds and subcultures and histories, and see them up close in a way that very few people get to see them, and go to places that very few people actually get to go, and come back and bring these stories back with you and tell the stories. It's sort of a feature, not a bug, that I have ended up writing about so many different subjects,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that was something I always set out to do.
Wonderful. Now I'm gonna link the hand dryer paper towel story
Sure.
in the show notes, but real quick, now I'm curious: is there a particular industry that has won?
No one has won, because you still get to see both.
Yeah.
Um, but I will say that during the pandemic, the paper towel industry had an upper edge because there was sort of a belief that the hand dryer would blow the coronavirus around public restrooms.
Oh
That
yeah.
was terrible for you. And so I think at that point, there was definitely sort of a 1 point handed over to the paper towel industry. But as I said, the charm of this entire industrial battle lies in the battle being fought. I mean, if one or the other had won, it would really be much more dull.
Yeah. Fascinating. All this being said, I found somewhat of a through line in at least parts of your writing. It seems that you've been invested in historicizing instances of othering in political situations, sometimes violent situations like in Sri Lanka. Your stories about India fit that. And you wrote this magazine piece about the suicide bombers and the Easter 2019 attacks, as well as pieces about the Jewish communities in Nigeria. All these fit this instance where you're trying to give history to this group of people that has been ostracized either within themselves or by another group, is going after that particular type of story a conscious choice? Or even if not, what about that type of story captures you? Because they also seem some of the most difficult to write.
I mean, I hadn't thought of all of these stories as belonging to the same bucket, but that's quite interesting. Well, I mean, look, the reason why so many of these, why there is a through line, is quite a superficial one, which is that wherever these kinds of othering, wherever that kind of process has taken place, inevitably it has led to some kind of strife.
Mm-hmm.
And strife is something journalists cover, whether it's something that is simmering strife, as in the case of India, or outright conflict and war, as in the case of Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
or a sort of, or the relic of strife gone by, as in the case of the Igbo in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
There is inherent drama and and history to such situations, and so you want to always kind of, when you're covering it, you obviously do always want to, this whole sort of place it in context, which seems like such an easy thing to say, but there's so many different kinds of contexts,
Mm-hmm.
and the historical one is, to me, interesting because it immediately is a way of drawing the camera back, of zooming out and kind of telling a story as it evolves through different generations,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of explains what impact each generation had on the story. And I think that's important because I think it's important that we in our own generation, for the purposes of this call, I will consider you and me the same generation. It's not
Okay.
true. We in our time, it's important that we don't see ourselves as out of history or sort of uniquely influential upon any long-term historical pattern. We are just as people were 50 years ago. We have about the same kind of influence, and we will not be the last people to have an influence on any
Yeah.
historical pattern. And so I think remembering that is important. It kind of lends, I don't want to say sanity because there's no sanity to conflict and war,
Mm.
but it lends a temporary shift of perspective that is essential when you think about really charged situations.
Yeah.
And the other reason is also, of course, that to show that othering itself is not something that began in our time.
Hmm.
And there's a historical pattern to the othering. And we are kind of inheriting that sometimes without even being aware of it. And very often the influences that generated some of this othering are not even ones that we tend to think of immediately. For example, in Sri Lanka, one of the things that I found interesting when I met somebody who was talking about the Sri Lankan census
Hmm.
was that about 120 years ago, the British broke the census up into numerous subcategories and subdivisions. Until then, the census had just been like, sort of very broad. So you were either Sinhalese or Tamil,
Hmm.
and you had your religions like Hindu and Christian and Muslim and so on. But then the British, at some point in their huge ambition to divide and rule, fragmented that census into a couple of dozen categories. So you could be
Okay.
sort of, you know, a particular denomination of Christian living
Oh,
in a
wow.
particular country, living in a particular part of the country and speaking a particular language, which is different from the same denomination of Christians speaking a different language, living in a
Oh,
different part of
wow.
the.
Okay.
So there was so the minute you start to fragment these identities that much as a political project, which is what the British were doing, that is sort of the trigger for a new kind of othering that persists to this day.
Yeah.
And so sometimes to pursue the historical roots uh, of these occurrences gives us these new insights into where they all began, where they were fed at some point in the past.
Fascinating. About the Sri Lanka story that you were just talking about, and a few of them that you've written, you write about how it's often difficult to justify the morality in telling stories behind these violent acts, specifically the one about the Easter bombings, when you're telling the stories of these brothers. How do you navigate these murky topics that often contain important stories that need to be told but have to be handled with care?
One would say that's the entire project of journalism. I mean, every
Yeah.
story is probably murky, morally
Hmm.
speaking. And the more murk there is, in a sense, the more a journalist needs to go after it to kind of figure out what is going on. But this is a different kind of murk, right? I mean, the thing that I was talking about in the piece was a quite existential story, so existential question of should the story be told at all? As a journalist, what is your responsibility in telling the personal stories of young men who became terrorists? When they did it for a particular kind of glorification,
Hmm.
and when your story may completely inadvertently help immortalize them in ways that other people can then read and sort of be inspired by. So at that point, what is your modality as a journalist? You or as a writer? You write about these people, or do you not? And it's difficult to say. I mean, at one level, you know, the absolutist in in the journalism field will say, well, look, that's just what a journalist has to do. It is up.
Yeah.
The consequences of writing the truth are not do not necessarily accrue to the journalist. I mean, that is somebody else's
Hmm.
concern. It is a concern of parents raising children who read these stories. It is a concern of their parents, the parents who set up this kind of moral universe where the children do not follow. It is a concern of law enforcement authorities who do not recruit based to make sure that other groups do not recruit based on these examples. It is a concern of religious institutions, be they churches or temples or mosques or anything, and the leaders in those institutions to make sure that these stories are not held up as examples. So that is somebody else's concern that absolutist would say. It is not my job here is to write the truth. And there's a certain sort of validity to that.
Hmm.
The journalist can't be expected to do everything.
Yeah.
Even in terms of corruption scams, for example, where but there's no moral sort of gray area in exposing a corruption scam.
Yeah.
It absolutely should be exposed. Um, but at the same time, that's all the journalist can do. The only thing the journalist can do is write about it. Similarly, I think like there is a validity to saying all the journalists can do is write these stories, and it is up to somebody else to or other people to protect readers from the consequences. It doesn't make it easier to do when you're actually sitting down in front of your laptop and kind of figuring out how to write them. And I think that is where the journalist can exercise a certain amount of responsibility, or the writer can, in sort of avoiding even inadvertent glorification, in sort of being extremely scrupulous about depicting these acts as inhuman and evil, as being extremely scrupulous about depicting the human toll that such acts take, not only in terms of the people who died, but even in terms of the family members left behind. I mean, all of that is, has to be put down in these long stories if you're kind of going to explore the lives of young men who became suicide bombers. It wasn't something that I necessarily needed to think about from the very first sentence, but it was something that was with me throughout when I was writing the piece and editing it. And even when I was interviewing people, in a sense, I mean, even when I was interviewing members of the family of these two young men who became bombers, the kinds of questions that you asked them were very different from questions I would have asked anyone else. And so, do you want to humanize them? Yes, because these are essentially human stories. These are human beings who got led astray and did unspeakable things. But to what extent do you want to sort of write about them and to kind of explain away their motivations and to rationalize their motivations? That's where I think the journalist's judiciousness comes into play.
On that note, slightly bleak, but for our final question, what have you been reading, watching, or listening to lately that's been exciting to you?
I'm extremely behind the times, so I only just finished watching Breaking Bad.
Okay.
I recommend it highly to the couple of you out there in the world who haven't seen it. What have I been reading? I've been reading books by this old sort of mid-century Japanese writer called Yasunori Kawabata.
Okay.
So I read The Master of Go, and now I'm halfway through a book called The Old Capital. I think Kawabata won the Nobel in the 1960s, and his books have been sort of in translation ever since. But they're very quiet, but really charged, potent narratives. They're all novels but the narratives of a society that is undergoing really violent change, which is post-war Japan. Violent change in the sense of what the society has to come to terms with in the aftermath of a military defeat, and in the aftermath of a kind of an occupation, really, by the U.S. military. But then also the other ruptures that are happening to societies all around the world at the time, which is mechanization and industrialization of a much more advanced degree, the withering away of artisanal skills, all of these things, and the generational shift between people who were born in the early 1900s and people who were born in the 1950s. And so I think something about that speaks to me, I think, because we're not that we're sort of living in post-war society, or some of us at least, but we are undergoing sort of extremely deep ruptures of our own. I sort of facetiously called you and me part of the same generation, but actually that's not true. And the world that I grew up in the late 80s and the early 90s, when I was a boy, is vastly different from the world that you grew up in when you were a boy. And I think the effect of that distance between the two can't be underestimated. I mean, I think a lot of what is going on in the world at the time, at this time, can be explained away by just a struggle of societies to come to terms with the rapidity of change around them. And I think I don't know, reading Kawabata for some reason makes me think about that stuff and gives me an alternate view on that kind of rupture.
Lovely. Definitely an interesting rec to take. And for the record, I am one of the two people that has not seen Breaking Bad.
Well, I recommend it highly. I think it's very good.
Lovely.
As an extremely original thinker, I would say it's a pretty good show.
Lovely. Thank you so much for being here. I believe that is all. This is great.
Thanks, Tejas. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for asking.
And that's our show. Special thanks to Samanth Subramanian for joining me on this episode. To learn more about his work and see a list of his recommendations, visit the show notes. Cultural Mixtapes is written and produced by me, Tejas Srinivasan. The music you heard on today's episode was Beethoven's Sonata No. 26 and Chopin's Sonata No. 2, recorded by me. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, review, and share on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you listen. Thank you very much for listening.